Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Ed Foster. This is a practitioner workshop, so there'll be slightly fewer statistics you may or may not be pleased to know. I'm going to talk about a piece of work that we've done. So within our own institution, Nottingham Trent University, which is a fairly large UK university with about 28,000 students. Some of the work going forward is, we'll make reference to a partnership that we're doing, which is an Erasmus project, or two Erasmus projects with the universities along the top. I'm new to Erasmus work, and apparently we're supposed to take a register of some description, so if you could just turn and wave to the camera, that'll do for me, if that's all right. So, I wasn't joking. Just wave at the camera. Okay, thank you very much. Right, okay, what are we going to do in the next 25 minutes? I'm going to cover 4 brief questions. So, why did we do this in the first place? What was our interest in the dashboard? What were the drivers that led to us doing it? What exactly is it? And obviously I'm going to skip over the details because of time, and how does it work? How have we managed the development of the resource? So a little bit, because it's an institutional case study, I'll talk a little bit about how we got to building this in the first place and where we are now and how it's embedded into the institutional systems. And then finally, the big question, has it led to transformational change to the experience of students and staff and made the world a better place too? You may be able to guess from the tone of my voice that what the answer to that is. So first of all, why were we interested in the dashboard? It comes from 3 pieces of work that we were doing at the time. The first of these is we were involved in a UK project called What Works? Student Retention and Success, looking at the question, not why is it that students drop out from university, but what are those factors that help students to stay? And we did a lot of work around a student sense of belonging, their engagement with their tutors, with their peers, things that help them to actually remain here at university. And what we found at the end of that is we had difficulty then landing that into our institutional structures. We found a lot of answers, we found a lot of research. What we struggled to do was then to bring about institutional change. The second thing that took place is we had an internal audit, and they looked across the institution and said, you know what, you're actually pretty good at student retention. You have a very diverse range of students with a whole range of different abilities and needs, and as an institution, you do well at keeping them. Not for all groups. If you are from a poorer socioeconomic background, if you're a male student or other groups, progression and attainment is poorer, but on the whole we do well. But what we didn't do very well was share data with staff. If you were a tutor, you can access information about students, but you often have to ask the right administrator. And it's not simple and it's not necessarily straightforward. And the final area of work was our IS department went out to the sector and they spoke to a range of commercial providers and said, look, can you do this? This learning analytics stuff is making all sorts of noise right now. What can you do? And a number of companies came forward and pitched, some wonderfully technical but struggled to understand what our needs were, and we finally went with a company called DTP Solution Path. We're broadly looking for 3 things from this piece of work. The first is looking at progression. Although we don't have a problem, we could be better, and we could be better for certain groups of students. So we think that there's something here about helping students to see that they may be less engaged than their peers that's absolutely crucial. The second factor was belonging. We really, really wanted to enable staff to have a little bit more information about the students that they were working with, because we have large student cohorts and we want to build a relationship between students and tutor from a very early stage, and we felt this was one of those tools that potentially could help us, and there's more work to do on it too. And the final area is around attainment, that we felt that if we could show students who are doing well, look, you are doing well, it might actually have some motivational benefits to them to push themselves harder and further. So at its core, the dashboard monitors students' engagement with their course. It's looking mostly at the electronic footprint at this moment in time, but it's looking at engagement with their course, and that's how we phrase this. We're not phrasing this as a risk tool. We're not saying you are highly at risk of failing. It's focused on you are engaging with those things that we can measure on your course. Now, of course, when we're looking at engagement, it contains all sorts of aspects, the cognitive, the affective, the relational, and the conative, which is the time on task. And that's really all we can measure in this is an aspect of that time on task. And that's the kind of focus of how we're doing. So if you like, where students use their cards to swipe into buildings, we measure that. We measure library use, logins to the VLE, and submission to the VLE Dropbox. And this academic year, we've also added in whether or not students are looking at electronic resources. So going to the databases and are they actually making any use there? And we've added attendance in for the first time, which has been interesting, because when I speak to academics, that's the one thing that they say, this cannot work if it doesn't have attendance data. It's just impossible without attendance data. It's not true, but it's always interesting to see someone speak. We now modified the measures, and I'm going to show you some feedback from the 13-14 academic year in a minute, and we've changed them slightly since then. So we have high, good, Partial, we used to call that satisfactory, and we changed that for a number of reasons. Low and not fully enrolled. And not fully enrolled means the student either never completed enrolment at the beginning of the year, so they were sort of due to participate but never quite did, or subsequently they're withdrawn from the course. If you could come up with a snappier way of saying that, I'd be really grateful, and we will change it tomorrow. I also want to emphasise that students and staff see exactly the same view. There is nothing hidden from students in this view. There's a few management screens that allow tutors to get to see the students that they've got responsibility for, but when you get down to the level of an individual student, students and staff see precisely the same information. There is nothing hidden from students. Now that may change over time as we explore and look at different factors, but we feel fundamentally there's something very positive about it being the same for both groups. Tutors have a little bit of extra functionality. They can add notes in following conversations, and tutors also receive an alert if there is no student engagement for a fortnight. So they have none of these contact points. They do no engagement at all. The tutor gets an alert to say, look, you might know why the student's not been around, but would you please investigate? Excuse me. Okay. I'm very struck by the fact that actually, no, I'll come to that in a minute. So what's the dashboard? How does it work? At its most basic level, it's just a dashboard. I understand that these ring donut things are quite fashionable at the moment, so get us to ride that particular trendy wave. I'm looking forward to see what next year's kind of fashion way of demonstrating data is. So this is a tutor's login screen, so if I'm an ordinary tutor, I can log in and I can see for a particular tutorial group what the overall engagement of those groups is. Once you get down to the individual level, and I'm only going to pick out bits of the dashboard for time, there's other aspects to this, but I'm just keeping it quite simple. So I probably should have been clever and made the second bit swipe in. Fundamentally, this is data from 2 students, and I took it yesterday for a colleague who was doing a workshop on the dashboard. The one on the left is a student who's got slightly better engagement. This is a student who's got high engagement, if you like. So just take the top left graph for a moment, and what you can see is the course average, so whoever asked the question at the back, thank you. And what you can see is this is a cumulative graph over the course of the year. So from the very beginning of the year, back in September, when students first started to engage with us, right through to this last week. And you can see the red line is the individuals, is the course average, and the blue line is this individual student. And I've picked an example of a student with high engagement. Now we like that cumulative graph because it gives you a nice picture overall of how students are engaging. But what we were very conscious of is that potentially if you've fallen behind, it might take quite a while to get back up to that average. So this second graph sitting underneath is much spikier, and that's a week by week graph. If you do nothing, it falls to 0. If you do lots of work, it shoots right up. And you can see, again, it's the same data over the same period of time, but it's much spikier because it's based on what students were doing in that individual time. And I've just put the 2 on because the graph on the left is for a student with high engagement, and the graph on the right is for one with low engagement. And you can see there are these gaps here. The slightly worrying thing is it almost looks like there's no engagement at all in the last couple, or there is no engagement at all for the last couple of weeks for this student. So what I would hope now is that a tutor is now beginning that process of making contact with the student to say, look, is there anything we can do to help? Just to give you an example, what the student can see, and students and staff can see, is most recent engagement. So this is just a student logging into our VLE, just an idea of where they've been, and because it shows both the resource rooms that they went into, or the resources they attached, and also the actual date that they logged in. So just to get a sense of the interaction. So this is the same 2 students, and this is the same student here with low engagement, and you can see there's kind of big gaps here about actually he's just not been into the VLE. Now, I think that's the kind of thing that I would hope a tutor's having a conversation with a student about anyway, but what's useful about this as a resource is you can see quite quickly by flicking through what kind of engagement students are having, and perhaps areas or activities that you could offer to them to encourage them to pick up that engagement and to do a little more. Okay, very briefly, the developmental journey. I've never been involved in a big IT project before, so this has all been a great joy and a pleasure to me. Actually, mostly a great joy and a pleasure, a few things that weren't. But we started off with a pilot in 13-14, and what we did is we worked in a very small group of people with experts from our IS department, from kind of learning and teaching, Student input was of course extremely important, and then other teams like student support services, study support, etc. So the idea was that we began very quickly. We worked through and got this off the ground within just a few months, and actually we piloted it with 4 academic courses in the 13-14 academic year, and the feeling was by the end of that, or partway through the year, that we'd got enough to make this useful, because it did all sorts of useful things, particularly for tutors in terms of that belonging, that working relationship between them and student. What makes me smile is, of course, we are a university and we like governance structures, so we went from having a fairly small and agile team to a proper grown-up governance set of structures. So, very briefly, because you never know, someone might be really interested in this stuff, we've got an operations group that sits and does lots of the what are we doing next, is it progressing, what do we need to do to make it work. We've then got a group looking at the ethics of this, and that's around things like how we describe it to students, and where we're asked to do novel and new ideas from people, particularly around academics wanting to do research. We've got a way of just checking, are we doing this in a sound manner? We've got a huge issue, I find, that a lot of we have lots of other university systems that we could tap into around, for example, students saying, I'm unable to sit this assessment because I'm ill or there's other problems in my life. And actually, can we usefully connect to that kind of data? Not that we'd ever share the actual content of that data, but perhaps the outcomes, so that if a student isn't due in or for whatever reason, we can see that. And we've got an informal student group where they consult and give us ideas and challenge us gloriously. The main thinking group has a representative from each of our academic faculties, students, developers, and people involved in the kind of making sure this works for the institution, and then it goes up through our academic governance structure. What, of course, I've missed out is the multiple different committees and groups of people, the great powerful beasts who have an input into what we do and how we do it. Okay, I'm very conscious that most of the time I present to the dashboard to what can be safely described as slightly sceptical academics. And so, of course, I'm starting with, is it accurate, etc., and does it do its job? Of course, I suspect with you lot, you're going, well, of course it does. This is what we do for bread and butter. So, if we take engagement, so this is a map of the 13-14 academic year, taking every single student. Now, we started from the very beginning of the year. We ran through weekends, we ran through Easter and Christmas breaks, and finished at the end of the academic year. This is what the average engagement for all of our students in that year looks like. It's low, so it's what we call satisfactory at that point, is the biggest block. But I think that what we wanted to do was to try and realistically reflect the kind of full breadth of when students are working, and they are working through all those breaks and times. We're likely to do a bit of playing with this just to see if we discount weekends or discount holidays, how does it look? But over the course of the year, if we look at the things that could be measured by the dashboard, this is what we got. So even though we were running a pilot year with just 4 courses, what we were able to do was to anonymize the data and look across the whole of the institution. So we've got a fairly small number of students with low engagement. Biggest block is those with satisfactory, good, and then high. So the important question really is there a relationship between engagement as measured by the dashboard and student progression? And I'm sorry, it's quite bitty on the screen, but just bear with me. This column here are students with low engagement. So if your average engagement over the course of the year was low, which means genuinely only a couple of touch points a week or even less as a student. If your average engagement was low over the course of the academic year, the blue bit, just under a quarter of those students progressed cleanly from the first year through to the second year, just under a quarter. A bigger block had academic failure, were repeating, transferred or withdrawn, etc. So there is a very strong relationship there between your average engagement and progression and attainment. When you go to the next column along satisfactory, straight away it jumps up to 80, I think it's 84% of students progressed from one year to the next. And then with good and high, you get to well over 90%. So there is an association there between what students do and their progression, which I think you'd probably expect, but it's useful for us to be reminded of it. We also wanted to just take a quick snapshot, and it's quite complicated, messy graph, but we just wanted to look at what happens over time. And if you just look at the mid-blue kind of columns here, all I'd want to emphasize is at the beginning of the year in the first couple of weeks, if your engagement is low on average, yes, you're less likely to progress than other students. However, it's not a terrible problem. But quite quickly, once students settle into these patterns, actually it becomes more problematic. The bit around Christmas was a mistake we should have broken that data up a little bit better. And you can see that actually the longer a student's engagement is low, the greater at risk they become. We also didn't explicitly search for this, but we checked it anyway. If you look at final year students, what was the relationship between engagement and their final degree classification. So in the UK, we've got this awful turn of phrase called a good degree, which is the two highest degree classifications, a first and a 2-1. If your average engagement is low, about 40%, 42%, 41%, sorry, 40-something% of those students got a 2-1 or a first, a good degree. If your average engagement is high, then actually it's 81%. The thing that's interesting here is that whilst we're looking at progression, progression is hugely outweighed by student engagement. Actually, factors like prior qualification seem to be much more relevant when it comes to final degree classification. Okay, but what we've proven with that, I think, is students doing certain behaviours do well, and students not doing certain behaviours don't do as well. And actually the important thing here is change. How do we change student behaviour? How do we move students with low engagement from where they are to going somewhere different? So we surveyed students. This is a piece of work we've just done with our first year students, and we asked them the question, when you use the dashboard, what are the kinds of things that you do? And we see that students are using it to just check their own engagement score, to see how they're doing. And this is the thing I like, is that starting to see changes in behaviour around them doing a little bit more in response to the question. And we asked a similar question in 2014. Just over a quarter of students said that they'd done something different as a consequence of seeing their data on the dashboard. Now, I freely acknowledge these are students who answered a survey, so I strongly suspect that they are biased towards a particular group of students. So very much, we do acknowledge that, and it's important to emphasise. And this for me, is also equally important, that what we wanted to do is to check with students, are your staff, are your tutors using the dashboard in conversations with you? So only a very small % of students said, yes, when I sit down and have a one-to-one conversation with my tutor, we're actually looking at the dashboard as part of that process. But amongst those who had that opportunity, they did find it very useful. And I'll be using this as part of our ongoing staff development with our colleagues to say, look, you need to be thinking about how we change or improve how we make use of the dashboard. Students use the dashboard far more than staff do because there's more of them, but they also appear to, on average, use it more. So we asked in a staff survey we conducted last summer this question around, how useful do you find the dashboard? For those who've only used it once or twice, then actually about 30% found it useful. For those who are using it about monthly, it's just over 50%. Those who are using it about weekly, it's well over 90% of them found it useful. And those of them using it only when they get an alert from the system saying there's been no engagement for a fortnight, it's about 60%. So there's obviously all sorts of cultural change needed here. So how do we bring about change? How do we encourage our staff to engage with this as a resource? And that's part of that ongoing process of hopefully working through our governance structures and certainly working with our colleagues. Okay, a couple of quick lessons then. So I'm very struck by the metaphor or the parallels between learning analytics software and timetables. And this is my bugbear, so you just bear with me a second. I think that the two are enabling tools. I think sometimes we get excited about learning analytics because it's super cool, and I think that we're all here and being super cool. But I'm also very conscious that there is something exciting about the new, and we're all focused on it. I don't imagine, although I may be horrified to be proven wrong, that there is a parallel conference taking place at some point this week on the planet looking at timetabling software. I may be wrong, but I suspect not. And I think sometimes there's a risk that learning analytics is an enabler. I don't know how much of a change agent it is in its own right. It's about how we make use of this to help our students through our interactions with them or other areas of work. So for me, the nub of the issue is this one. So we're obviously looking at learning analytics from a particular point of view. We're looking at quite big picture stuff, looking at overall how students are engaging with their course. But what we're interested in is then, how do we help staff or students themselves to bring about change? So this is Mousetrap, the game. So kind of hands up if you ever had this as a kid. Okay, hands up if you ever wanted it as a kid and didn't. Okay. Okay, so this for me, I think there's something here that I think is useful. So I can't remember how you play it exactly, but my recollection is when you get to the end here, you've got to not be got by the mousetrap or be got by them, whichever way around it goes. But essentially, I think you build the mousetrap as the game goes on. And my metaphor, if you like, is that with learning analytics is the point where you first turn that first crank, which then kicks the boot and drops the ball down, and the bathtub and the diver, all the rest of it. And the diver is the point where the academic leaps into action. And the dashboard itself is the point where we turn stuff. But actually, there's all these other things that I think need to take place around it. So for the academic to jump into the bathtub, they need time, they need training, they need the motivation, they need easy access to the data itself, they need a room to talk to the student or a space to actually email them. And I think that sometimes for me, what the crux of all this is that just knowing a student has a problem isn't actually all that helpful. It's around what do we do next as a consequence to that. So where we're going as an institution, and I've forgotten who this is, but he's on the side of one of our buildings, so I thought I'd go cultural for us. If we're looking at, sorry, plenty of time. If we're looking at the next few pieces of work, so where do we go next with this? There is obviously work to continuously work on IT infrastructure, the various management structures that we've got in place, looking at quality, looking at what we do next. We've also got some work on new data sources. We won't do much on that because actually I think we've got a lot already, and particularly as we've added these 2 sources in this year around ebooks and attendance. But we'll look at options for further inputs. So there's other aspects of the dashboard. So what do we do around kind of the design of it and that kind of work? And student comms, and if anything, I've underplayed this. We communicate to our students during their induction. We've got resources online. We do we do emails out to them throughout the course of the year, but actually we still haven't done enough to make this a normal part of our working practice. But for me, the really big stuff is this. It's integrating what we do with the dashboard into our working practices. So from 2016-17 onwards, what we're doing is, and partly through these ABLE and Stellar Erasmus projects, is taking a look at what do we do to lead to change, to get staff to engage with this process more. So within each of our 9 faculties, what will happen is there'll be a small pilot study looking at different aspects of the use of the dashboard. Now that might be the alerts. So for example, instead of just sending an alert to the tutor, do we also experiment with sending an alert to the student at the same time? Things like that. The way we use the notes pages, the way we look at things like appointment booking. So at the point where a student's had a problem, how do we then help facilitate the discussion with a further expert, maybe a counsellor or a study support advisor? Obviously, we need to do some work on staff development. So how do they use these resources and tutorials? Looking at survey tools and tests. So could we identify learner types as part of that initial piece of work, and could that help modify how the dashboard works? And then those links through. And finally, stuff that we haven't considered yet. So from my point of view, I think we're in a really interesting place that's really exciting, but there's a shed load of work still to be done. I think that's me done. Thank you. Is there anyone any questions?
All right, questions for Ed? I'm going to start in the back this time. Sorry, I like to be unpredictable. Here we go. Oh.
Okay, right, I won't ask again. Okay, so thank you. I thought it was a fascinating talk there. Thank you very much. So I think the holy grail of learning analytics is to try and measure the positive impact, and you sort of hinted at it, that it's more difficult to do. How far away do you think you are from measuring the positive impact of your whatever interventionist methods you use? And ultimately, I hate to say it, but retention. Can you ever see you coming up with a statistic that says we've improved retention, which is what senior management are looking for? Yeah,
of course. I think we'll be able to have some. We'll certainly by the end of the next academic year, we'll have run at least some of those pilots through for the whole year. And I think we'll have something we can feed back there. One of our schools in particular is currently looking at how it identifies students, so that they're looking to build a team around spotting students with low engagement rather than relying on one tutor at a time to do it. In our pilot year, we had these 4 courses, these 4 first-year cohorts. Beautifully, on 2 of them, retention improved, and on the other 2, it went down. So I thought it's kind of perfect karma. On the 2 that it dropped, actually the course size increased, and one of them it went up by a third. So you can start to justify all sorts, but actually there was no clear-cut answer. But I think for me it is about the use of this, and that's going to take further time to work through, if you like. So we're not there, but we hope to have answers by perhaps this time next year.
Hi, brilliant talk. Thank you very much. Question I have, and we struggle with this, similar things here, but you have a feature there where it's sent a note to the tutor saying, essentially, please intervene.
Yeah.
Here's the issues. Do you track whether they intervene or not?
Okay. Not yet. And the reason for that is partly because we're running at great speed, but there's also been, when we've consulted both staff and students, the students actually are less concerned about the ethics of this. In fact, the thing that's frightened students more than anything is actually the sudden realization that we have all this data. So actually they're genuinely surprised that this data sits on a database somewhere. So that's been the first thing. When we talk to staff are much more concerned from a much deeper, more ethically nuanced and considered perspective. But one of the things that does come back is that, and I've been accused of being Stalinist, which is quite amusing personally, which I think actually says more about the person who sent that kind of concern. But actually this isn't a learning analytics tool, this is a staff management tool. So we're quite wary about that. So I think as a halfway house, what we will do is, in this forthcoming academic year, we'll build in, within the student's dashboard page, the account around the number of times that an alert has been sent to the tutor. So we'll start gentler, but we will build up to having that kind of data available. But I think we need to be quite careful with it, because we're still at that phase where we're trying to win people over to this way of being a positive thing to do, rather than here's a big stick and you will do it in this particular fashion. Partly because of that problem of staff don't necessarily have space and time to sit and do proper interventions in that way. So there is work to be done there on meshing the IT with the real world.
And then maybe if you tracked, did they see the tutor and did they do what the tutor told them to do and change the emphasis of why you might be tracking that?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's James. I'm from Aston University, and we're implementing a similar style program, but we're a few steps behind. I guess just quickly on the personal tutor front, one model been looking to implement is a sort of a staggered approach. So there's a super tutor within the school who then acts as like an intermediary between central services and the tutor, and that's one that we're having some success with. But my actual question was, in terms of your VLE data, our VLE is not used anything like consistently across the programs in the schools. How effective outside of your test cohort of programs do you think the VLE data will be used?
I think there's been a drive to have some consistency of use, and I think it's pretty consistent now. It's not perfect, but it's fairly consistent. When we've looked across the whole of the institution, and we've looked at even courses like art and design where the VLE use might be relatively low, actually the same patterns are there. So that just time on task in itself is a good indicator that you, as a tutor, you might need to be talking to your students. So I don't know with this that we'll ever get to perfection. I strongly suspect we never will, but I think we've got good enough data to be able to work off it.
Two questions. One very short. You mentioned that you survey the students and ask them how often they look at the dashboard. Couldn't the dashboard tell you that? And the second one, while we're here, is you also said you're not telling them about risk, and I'm wondering why.
Okay, right. So could we invest the dashboard? Yes, and we do have that data back. The reason that we asked them for this particular survey was we wanted to give some context to the questions, the responses that they were giving. So at that point, it was quicker and easier to get them thinking and do it in that particular setting. So do we tell them about risk? What we've tended to do is we've pushed out much more that second. If I just go back, we've pushed out this data more. So what we've said to students is, look, there's an association between high engagement and getting a good degree outcome, and that's the line that we've taken, because I think there's a subtlety here about the use of the word average. So if we start to say to students, if your average engagement is low, you are highly likely to not progress or to fail, actually they'll just hear low engagement, fail, and I think we need to be just careful around that. And that's not to insult our students' intelligence, but I just think they're surfacing or skimming through this kind of stuff, and I want to keep it quite simple. So we have focused very much on that positive message of, if your engagement is high, you are more likely to get a good degree outcome.
Okay, I think we have time for another question, and all right, I got to move back this way a little bit.
It is just a technical question.
Oh.
I've seen in one of the slides that you are using the time spent variable included in the engagement calculations.
Sorry, it's not. It's just whether or not they've logged in. So there's almost just a, are they using it at all?
Oh, just like they were there, not how long they've been interacting and duration or things like that?
I think we talked around using it, but I think what my understanding is of the way students use the VLE is that they'll have a number of tabs open, including the VLE, and that might be open for hours, but they've dipped in and they've done 20 other things at the same time. So it was just we've put that in because we can share that information with the students. In reality, we're just looking for answer that question, are they using it at least reasonably frequently?
Okay, thank you.